Hello and welcome to the Inflation Drivers and Dynamics webinar sponsored by the Central Bank Research Association and the Center for Inflation Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. Today we have two speakers, and the session will be moderated by Rob Rich at the Center for Inflation Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, and I'll hand the microphone over to him to introduce those speakers.
Thank you, Dominic. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending upon where you are. Thank you for joining the webinar. The topics of today's sessions are how inflation expectations disanchor, the role of selective memory cues, and the long-term effects of inflation on inflation expectations. I want to express my thanks to the organizers, Raphael Schonle from Brandeis University and SEBRA, and Dominic Smith from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Let me just very quickly provide some background information. The webinar is 45 minutes in total, with two presentations of approximately 15 minutes each. Today, however, we will change the Q&A format and take questions after the presentation of each paper rather than at the end. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio video, but are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. Attendees can, of course, post their questions during a presentation, so you do not need to wait until the end. I will then select questions to be answered in the QA portion of the webinar after the presentations. The webinar is also live streamed via the SEBRA YouTube channel and is also recorded and made available on the SEBRA website and SEBRA YouTube channel after the event. And as a disclaimer, participation in the SEBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of the views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a SEBRA or SEBRA co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of SEBRA, the co-sponsoring institutions, or any other participating institution. So with all of that as background, I would like to introduce today's speakers. Our first speaker is going to be Nicola Giannoli, who's a professor at Bocconi University. He'll be talking about how inflation expectations disanchor the role of selective memory cues. Our second speaker will be Felix von Meyerinck, Senior Research Associate at the Department of Finance of the University of Zurich and affiliated research at the Hamburg Financial Research Center. He'll be discussing the long-term effects of inflation on inflation expectations. So Nicola, the floor is yours. And as a reminder, he will take questions after his presentation.
Thanks a lot, Rob. Let me share my screen. Okay, so thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about disanchoring of inflation expectations, which is somewhat of a new topic because we thought before that inflation expectations were rigid, either because there is costs of processing, as in rational inattention, or because they are anchored to past experiences. And what we saw in April 2021 was something very different, as you see from this graph. Inflation expectation in the US, and this is the New York Fed survey, were about 3% before April 2021, and then they jumped very sharply to a 6-7% afterwards. Why this big jump? And why, in particular, here there are different age cohorts, older people, 65 plus, the blue line, revise them upward so sharply compared to young people. You would expect the elderly, if their views were anchored to the past, to be slower. Here, they're much faster. One possibility may be to argue maybe the elder have a increase index, grows faster than for the young. But if you look at the data, actually, and this is data from Javier Jaraviel, more orange is younger here. The CPI increase is faster for the young, which depends the puzzle. Why did the elderly react so much? Why did they become so much more pessimistic about inflation? And the explanation that we are going to give is that to explain this disanchoring, memory, selective memory, is critical. And in particular, the idea is that inflation expectations are formed under context-dependent cues. When inflation increases, this cues you to recall past experiences of high inflation. And because the elderly have more past experiences of high inflation than the young, because they lived through the 70s. When they see high inflation today, they are reminded of those, and so they selectively retrieve them, and these experiences previously forgotten boost now their inflation expectations. And so in order to kind of approach this question more systematically, we wanted to found, this expectation formation process into the science of memory, selective memory in humans. And, this builds on work that I did in the past with Bordalo and Schleifer on memory-based beliefs. And I want to show like a few regularities of recall that emerge from these experiments. These experiments in cognitive science typically give people a list of words to study: tape, mole, dead, flood, etc. And then after a while, after a distraction, people are asked to recall what they have studied. And so that's how you can study the selectivity of retrieval, the selectivity of memory. And what are the regularities?
Nicola,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you minimize? For some reason, I appear to be showing up in the bottom of your screen. Can you minimize me or take me off? Thank you.
Okay. So how do people recall? What are the regularities in recall of this word list? The first one is primacy and recency effect. So, words that are in later serial positions that are studied later, closer to when the recall takes place, have a higher probability of being remembered. And that's kind of something that intuitively already present in some economic model with experience effects. But what this shows is that there is also a primacy effect, which is the first word you studied, that it's very far from now. It's still more likely to be remembered than the last. And so you have this U-shaped pattern. That's something that we can look at in the data. And the second is semantic similarity. If you now recall a word like car and you studied wheels, then you're likely to recall wheels because it's similar to car, and you're less likely to recall, apple that you studied, but it's dissimilar to car, which you just recalled, which is to say the pattern of retrieval also depends on whatever is similar in a semantic sense. And this can be important for inflation expectation, because when inflation is at 10%, the semantic content is 10%, which is very different from inflation being at 3%. And so the type of memories that you will retrieve will be different in those situations. And this will turn out to be critical for the de-anchor. And so how do you think about these effects in an economic model? With Andrei and Pedro, we have a general model of beliefs, and here we try to apply it in an inflation context in which we can use existing survey data to sort of analyze the predictions. And so we have a memory database that is composed by quarterly inflation rates experienced monthly since age 16. And these are all these, this is long vector of inflation rates that varies across cohorts. And then this database is accessed on the basis of memory cues, and these cues can be state dependent. And so there is two cues that influence what you retrieve. The first is the current inflation that you observe today, and that received a weight Q1, and which means if you sort of see 10% inflation, you're more likely to recall past experiences from the database of similar inflation at 10%, 12, 9%. And that's the first cue. The second cue, importantly, is the type of inflation events you're thinking about the future. And that cue has a weight Q2, which is 1 minus Q1, which is to say, if I'm thinking about average inflation next year, what I am thinking about in terms of future event is the entire spectrum of possible inflation realization. And this prompts by similarity retrieval of something different than if I ask you to recall inflation experiences that you lived between 3% and 2%. So that is the range that you are thinking about that affects what you retrieve. And so these two aspects are operative and innate selective retrieval at each point in time from the database I described. And so what you need in order to close the model is to specify a similarity function that maps these cues into what is their similarity to the past experiences in the database. And so what we model similarity, we use a standard model of similarity in which similarity exponentially decay in the divergence between the temporal feature of an experience with the Q and the numerical value of an experience from the Q. And so what is the divergence of a past experience pi t minus s that you experienced s years ago when the current inflation at time t is pi t and when you are thinking about inflation range r? Well, the first component is numerical similarity, which is the divergence increases. You see the first term in the gap between the past experience inflation pi t minus s and the current inflation level pi t. The second component of divergence is also a numerical distance that captured the difference between the inflation you experience at t minus s, pi t minus s, and the midpoint of the range that you're thinking about, which here we call pi r. So that's numerical dissimilarity. And then we capture the primacy and recency effect by a function beta, which is U-shape of how far in the past, how many years ago s, a certain experience happened compared to your age a. And so primacy effect would want this beta function to be high for large s. And recency, sorry, this is a distance, so primacy effect would want this beta function to be low distance for large s, and the recency effect would want this distance function to be also low when the experience is recent, so for low s. And so we use a tractable quadratic specification that entails this inverse U-shape primacy recency effect of past experiences. And so given this distance, what is the probability of recalling a past experience s years ago, pi t minus s, given that the current inflation is pi t and you're thinking about the range pi r, is a negative exponential of the distance function that I just showed. And so according to this recall probability, more frequently experienced numerical values are more often retrieved because they have more copies in the database. But crucially, the experience effect is non-mechanical because you're going to overweight experiences that are highly similar, have a low distance with the present, and you will underweight experiences that are highly dissimilar, have a high distance from the present. And so something that was forgotten will be recalled now if situations change. So how do we then model survey beliefs? We have that the probability with which a respondent would answer in a survey question that inflation in the future will be in range R is the sum of the probability of recall of experiences that fall into that R bucket. And the point expectations, which will be the main interest here, are computed as the average recalled experiences from the database using the recall function R of those experiences conditional on the memory cues, which are, the current inflation level pi t and the inflation range. And so, this equation shows you that for two things, that first of all, there is a state dependence. As I said, changes in current inflation pi t change what memories come to mind. And so what inflation I expect for the future. And second, if I ask you about ranges, or if I ask you about point expectations, what comes to mind changes, because the other aspect of the Q, the future events you're thinking about, changes as well. So what do we do then in terms of empirics? You can linearize the expression, and in this case, we are dealing with point expectations around the point in which memory, similarity does not matter. And so what would be the point expectations approximated around that point? It would first consist of a term which is the average lifetime experience inflation. And this is the average equally weighted inflation level that you've experienced. This is as if there is no selectivity. This is sort
Nicola, we seem to have lost your audio. Nicola? Oh. Oh. Nicola? I don't know. We seem to have lost your audio. Okay, we'll maybe give Nicola maybe a minute or so to possibly regain his audio, but if not, then perhaps Felix, we may have to move on to you. So, let's see. Oh, well, I think, yeah, maybe. So Felix, I think at this point, we're going to have to perhaps move on to you and ask you to do your presentation, if that's okay.
Yeah, happy to.
Thanks.
And of course, also wait 2 more minutes. Can you see my screen? Yeah.
Yes.
Rob, am I still showing you? No.
No. Fortunately, I've only had to appear I've only had to be taken off the stage once, which is good for everybody. So I think we're good. Thanks
Okay,
for asking.
fantastic. Thanks for having me. I'm stepping in for Michael. Michael is stuck on a plane, and now he just texted me in a cab in Sao Paulo with poor cell phone coverage, so he's not even able to dial in. The paper that I'd like to present is entitled "The Long-Term Effects of Inflation on Inflation Expectations." Joint work with Fabio Bragion from Tilburg, Nick Schaub, who's at WHU in Germany, and Michael Chicago Booth. As you probably all know, what we do in the paper, we study, the title suggests, long-term effects of inflation on inflation expectations. And we are interested in how did the German hyperinflation of the 1920s affect today's inflation expectations, so around 100 years later. Motivation, well, probably obvious. Following the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine, inflation resurfaced around the globe in almost all countries. And for many, like including myself, it's the first time that we experience inflation substantially above central bank's target. So the question is, to what extent can inflation shocks affect inflation expectations, and what is the horizon over which they can affect inflation expectations? That's part one of the motivation. The second part is this well-known bias in inflation expectations. What do we mean? Well, we know that average inflation expectations of households tend to be upward biased relative to exposed realizations. And what we propose in this paper is that maybe like inflation shocks in the very distant past, such as the one that we study in the paper, could serve as a potential explanation, meaning that if inflation was very high 100 years ago and still impacts inflation expectations, and this may explain why we see this upward bias in inflation expectations. And a very brief motivation, historical inflation as a potential explanation. What we show here is a graph, average inflation expectations for 2023 in the year 2022 by country. And on the left, we have the countries that in Europe that did not experience a hyperinflation before the 1930s. And on the right, we see the countries that did experience a hyperinflation before the 1930s. And what we see here is a difference in today's inflation expectations of more than 1%. And we think that is consistent with the idea that these very long-term effects of inflation shocks may be a driver of inflation expectations. What is probably important to say here is that realized inflation rates between these two buckets of countries, they were very, very similar. What do we do in this paper? Well, we investigate the relation between inflation in the distant past and today's inflation expectations. Specifically, we ask, like, can the difference in local inflation in the distant past explain differences in today's local inflation expectations, and then related what mechanisms are at play. And what I also touched upon the setup before, we studied Germany as a lab. We think that Germany provides a close to ideal setting to do that. Germany, as I mentioned before, experienced a hyperinflation in 1922, 1923, pretty much 100 years ago. This period, only very few individuals living today experience themselves, because the people living 100 years ago, most of them passed away. Yet there's plenty of anecdotal evidence in Germany that this period shapes attitudes towards inflation more broadly. And this is kind of the motivating part, that you see a lot of discussion now, 100 years later, on the causes and consequences of the German hyperinflation. On top of that, motivation, of course, the data. We have very granular data on realized inflation, local realized inflation during the hyperinflation. For around 600 towns, we have monthly inflation data. And we compare it with the data on today's inflation expectations of households. And for those households, we know the zip codes, even in some data sets, we know the zip codes. So we compare it at the very local level and study the relationship between historical inflation and today's inflation expectation. The paper in one graph, what we do is we take these historical towns, almost 600 towns, and we sort them into 5 buckets: the historical towns with the lowest cumulative inflation during the hyperinflation, and the towns with the highest inflation during the hyperinflation. And then we look at the survey respondents living in these towns. And then for each of these 5 buckets, we plot expected inflation rates. Okay? And what we observe is this upward slope, which implies that towns with higher inflation in the past tend to have higher inflation expectations today. When you think about the magnitude, then the difference between the lowest bucket and the highest bucket is around 0.6, almost 0.7 percentage points, which is considerable when you keep in mind that the realized inflation rate in the time period that we talk about here, or that the survey covers, has been around 0.8%. So it's close to the realized inflation rate. Okay, this is kind of the punchline of the paper. Of course, in the paper we do more sophisticated regression analysis, but all in all, this is pretty much the paper in one graph. What's the contribution of our paper? We think we contribute to 2 streams of the literature, both 2 large streams. The first one is on the formation of macro expectations more generally, inflation expectations in particular. The papers have documented a number of determinants of households' inflation expectations, including lifetime experiences, cognitive abilities, observed prices in daily life, monetary policy communication, and so forth. And what we bring to the table, and we think this is important, is to show that prior generations' experience also matter for the formation of inflation expectations, because that would imply that, like, shocks on or inflation shocks have the ability to shape inflation expectations in the very long run. And then the other large literature that we speak to is the literature on long-run persistence. In economics, there's this large literature showing that events in the very distant past, they impact today's socioeconomic outcomes in a variety of settings. And we show this for inflation. We show that historical inflationary periods, they determine attitudes towards inflation in the very long run. Very briefly on the historical background, the German hyperinflation can be, or the origins can be traced back to the onset of World War I. With the beginning of the war, many countries abandoned the gold standard. So many countries, including the Deutsche Reich, Germany essentially. Germany during the time had to finance current expenditures. For sure, the war and following the defeat, the reparation payments and the printing money increasingly became the way to meet these financial obligations. So essentially, they brought unseen amounts of money into circulation. As a result, inflation increased substantially in the 1920s and 1922, and inflation spun out of control in late 1923. In October 1923, the mark, the currency, stood at 6 billion to 1 relative to its pre-war value. And in November 1923, the government then introduced a very successful stabilization policy that stopped the inflation. What you see here, we have more graphs in the paper, but what you essentially see is that until World War I, the beginning of World War I, there were very similar inflation trends for Germany, the rest of the world, and also the US. And then there's a large divergence until stabilization. Late 1923 was the stabilization, and then again, fairly similar inflation paths, and these similar inflation paths say almost continue for the whole time period that followed after. What data do we use? Let's first talk a little bit about the data on inflation expectations, our outcome data. The requirements that we have for this data is that we need to geocode the respondents in order to locate them pair them with our historical inflation data set. And of course, we want to have data on inflation expectations. And these requirements are met by 3 surveys. The Gesellschaft für Konsumforschung Consumer Climate Max survey is part of the harmonized EU survey on consumer confidence. Each month, they survey around 2,000 households. And the data doesn't contain the raw data, doesn't contain the zip codes, but we were provided with the zip codes for the respondents by the GfK, the company running the survey, for the period December 2013 to March 2017. That's kind of the main data set that we use, also the one where I showed the figure. And then we have 2 additional data sets, surveys from the Deutsche Bundesbank. One is the Deutsche Bundesbank's online panel of household finances. That's a survey that's done a number of times. And in one year, 2011, they also survey inflation expectations. And on top of that, they have respondents counted residents. And for some analysis, we also use the Bundesbank online panel households, which is the new Bundesbank online survey. It's very large, has 2,000 to 7,500 households, but it only starts in April 2020, and it also contains the county of residence, so a little bit more granular when it comes to location. And that's the outcome that we talked about. Now we are moving back in time and look at realized inflation during the hyperinflation. So between December 1919 and December 1924, the Statistical Office of the time constructed the CPI based on a basket of goods considered representative for a family of 5 members. It's surprisingly similar compared to today's CPIs that we see. Majority of the basket is daily groceries and so forth. So CPI data is available for 633 towns in Germany, and 530 of these towns are in contemporary Germany, because Germany was larger. We will talk about that later, about the remaining towns. What we do is then we assign these today's zip codes to the closest town for which we have local CPI data. And then for each of today's zip code, we compute cumulative local inflation for this period 1920 to 1924. And then we end up with this map of the German zip codes. The darker shading indicates higher inflation. And what you also can see here is that the white dots, those mark the towns for which we have historical inflation data. What do we do empirically? We essentially explain the expected inflation rate of the survey respondent with the historical inflation rate, and we add some household controls and historical controls and fixed effects. The expected inflation rate is the 1 year ahead inflation rate that the households provide an estimate of in the survey. Historical inflation is essentially a measure of the cumulative inflation between 1920 and 1924. Household controls is a rich set of respondent characteristics, including stuff like age, gender, which are essentially to capture all the variables, all the determinants of inflation expectations that the literature has documented. Historical controls is a set of town characteristics that we find in the prior paper to be correlated with inflation expectations, with historical inflation. And then we have time and region fixed effects. Okay, what's the intuition of this model? What do we want to do? We want to compare households living in different locations, but having the same observable characteristics. And that's kind of what we try to do. People being exactly identical when it comes to education, gender, age, and whatnot, but they live in different locations. And because they live in different locations, their ancestors have experienced different inflation rates during the hyperinflation. This is kind of the first set of results. It uses the sample from GfK, also the sample that was underlying the graph. What we find here across these 4 columns is a positive and significant coefficient. The coefficient in column 1 suggests that a 1 standard deviation increase in historical inflation results in a 0.5 percentage point increase in inflation expectation, which is roughly similar to the graph that I've shown before in terms of economic magnitude. Across columns here, we have different types of fixed effect, state time, county time. We fix different location and time dimensions, but these results go through pretty much independent of the specification that we choose. What we do next, we move to these different types of Bundesbank surveys. First to PHF. There we can also replicate the finding, although we have a much smaller sample and only 1 cross-section because the data only covers the year 2011, or surveys has only been done once in 2011. And we can also replicate the same finding with the Bundesbank online panel household, which is larger, starts in April 2020. And here we can also use state fixed effects. That's pretty much kind of the first part of the data, is to show that there's a persistent correlation between historical inflation and inflation expectations. And it's fairly robust across these different surveys. That's kind of one of the first findings of the paper. That's of course consistent with inflation expectations today being a function of historical realized inflation over the very long run. One alternative explanation that you could come up is persistence in local inflation. If local inflation is persistent over a very long time, households' inflation expectations would primarily reflect contemporary inflation. Okay, so what we do to test for this alternative explanation is to relate historical local inflation to today's local realized inflation. Okay? And what we do at the moment is we use local realized inflation estimates from Rewe, which is a large German supermarket chain, and we essentially scrape their websites, and then we get a very, very large data set of local prices. And we compute local CPI, and we are currently in the process of getting the raw data of the German CPI, so CPI microdata, but that's work in progress. Essentially, what we find, pretty much independent of how we slice this data, we don't find a relationship between historical inflation and today's realized inflation, which we think is consistent with the idea that today's inflation expectations are the function of historical realized inflation and not function of today's local realized inflation. But then again, this is work in progress. We are currently getting our hands on the CPI data. After having established this effect of historical inflation on inflation expectations, we want to think a little bit more about the mechanism. We have 2 potential mechanisms in mind. The first one is transmission from parents to children. Cultural traits are transmitted from one generation to the next, and this would then imply that we find the relationship between past and today's inflation only in households without a migration background, because the households live with the migration background, well, their ancestors, they didn't have the experience of the hyperinflation. And that we can actually do in the PHF data because we have the migration status in the data, and we find exactly that in the households with a migration background, they don't respond, or their inflation expectations cannot be explained by local realized inflation. Second mechanism that we have in mind is transmission through local collective memory. And here the idea is that differences in past inflation, they shaped local institutions such as the media or other local institutions differently. And it's these differences in local institutions that form inflation expectations. And we do two things here. We look at politicians' speeches in the German parliament and test whether politicians from these high inflation areas are more likely to speak about inflation. And that is exactly what we find in the data. And we also look at media coverage of inflation, and we find here that the media seems to reflect or differentially reflects inflation depending on the historical inflation rates that we saw in the past. We also look at updating of inflation expectations. This is a similar motivation as Nicola just mentioned. So we think that households living in an area with higher historical inflation, we find that they are more likely to recall the hyperinflation and update inflation expectations more strongly, which may be because the queue of inflation today has a different recall or recalls of different inflation experiences made by prior generations. We also look at financial decisions. Households in areas with higher historical inflation are less likely to hold fixed income investments. That's what we find here. And then the final part of the paper is that look at Poland. I mentioned that out of the 100 towns in the historical data, they are in what we think is, or what is currently Poland. And then we can basically replicate our analysis for today's Poland. That's what you see on the left here, the map of Poland, and the light shaded area is the area for which we don't have historical inflation data. And essentially what we find is that very similar coefficients in the baseline. And then once we control for the displacement or the migration post World War II, we find that historical inflation matters for the formation of inflation expectations. Let me briefly conclude. We studied the association between local inflation during the 1920s and current subjective inflation expectations. Inflation expectations are higher in areas with higher inflation in the 1920s, and it seems that both intergenerational transmission and these local institutions foster the transmission of this experience. Thank you so much for listening and watching. It was a pleasure.
Great. Thanks, Felix. So again, I'd like to encourage people to go ahead and if they have questions to go ahead and submit. Since I appeared visually early in the presentation, I'm going to ask a couple of questions if that's all right for you. So thanks again for presenting this. So I guess you may have touched on this. So one question I have is the experience that you're talking about, is it if you were to survey over a calmer inflation episode, right? I guess my question is, does the sort of inflation surge trigger sort of a recall that generates then people to remember these disparities? And I guess my question would be, if you could have controlled, would you have observed any differences sort of pre-inflation surge? In other words, how persistent are these memories? Would you still observe some heterogeneity across these different regional groups in a lower inflation environment? Or is there something special about moving into an inflation surge that sort of triggers them? And perhaps that was covered in there, but I'm just trying to sort of think about how persistent are these memories, and then sort of are they always there, or is there sort of a mechanism that sort of recalls them? So hopefully that was coherent in terms of my question.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting to observe differences in updating, right? So what we do in one of these analyses in the paper is that we study this more recent period, like the figure that I've shown you has the data 2013 to 2017. Unfortunately, we cannot extend it further. But in the Bundesbank online panel households, we basically see the surge in inflation 21-22. And what we see there is that these areas with higher historical inflation, they update stronger. So it seems to be that this recalling of this experience is different depending on how much historical inflation you're experiencing. And we think that's an interesting finding because it relates to what Nicola mentioned, right? Like the experience that you have, they are recalled by the cues, which can be observed inflation. And in our case, it seems to be that it's not only lifetime experiences that are encoded in the database, as Nicola mentioned, but also like experiences made by prior generations. They can also be recalled by cues. And I think that makes sense. I'm not an expert on the memory literature, but I'd have to look more closely whether this memory literature has looked at encoding, and with encoding in this database, meaning prior generations experiences also being able to recall. Like intuitively, it makes sense, but I'm not sure what this memory literature has to say about experiences made by prior generations.
So if I can I follow up with one other question, which is I'm sort of intrigued or interested in thinking about monetary policy communication, right? So you now are in a situation where you are, especially in a situation where the monetary policy authority is instituting, let's say, a particular target, right? I guess there's an interesting aspect of credibility here, which is that there's one thing to sort of just get people to sort of believe in the target, but now there's this heterogeneity across individuals, right? So I guess that raises the question about not only trying to communicate what your target is, but you may need to recognize that across the demographic groups or the different inflation experiences. And I guess that would require to some extent some additional thought in terms of how to get messages to those individuals that in some sense are having somewhat different inflation expectations stemming from this experience. So maybe you could speak to that. I would just be interested in that.
Yeah, I have to think about this more, but intuitively, this is what our findings imply, right? The interesting dimension, I think, with our findings is that we control for observable demographics. We do spatial identification, so I think what we'd have to think about more is there are local differences, and these local differences seem to matter. And I think what you're referring to would not only speak to demographics in terms of like age or different age groups, but it would mean that communication would have to differ locally because these local experiences in the distant past matter. I know that there's some work on differences, and like Michael has done some work, but I think here it's a geographic dimension. And that would, of course, be very difficult, right? Like, how do you differentiate monetary policy communication geographically? That's probably doable in the 1920s, where like the information was contained locally. But I think these days, where you have very transparent media, where you have media with global outreach, differing communication locally, it's very difficult to do.
Great. So we have time for one more question. So we have a question from Raphael, which is, what is your sense how far historical memory reaches back, especially for particular commodity prices? Also, Europe had the most deflation in the 19th century.
So our data, which is fantastic. Like in terms of granularity, this data is great, but it only covers 1920 to 1924. And it was collected, it's an interesting side note on the data. It was collected because of wage setting negotiations. So the Labor Statistics Office collected the data and built the CPI. It wasn't the price division of the statistical office, but it is 1919, end of 1919 to 1920. And then you have, this is a local dimension. And then when it comes to time series only, there is interesting data in the time series. But we are interested in the local dimension. So it's hard to find data with a consistent time series on the local dimension. So yeah, there's nice data when it comes to the time series for wheat. For these standard products, commodities, you can probably build 200-year time series, but at local dimension, very, very difficult.
Great. So with that, I think we just are about out of time. So I'm going to end by maybe asking Raphael. I want to begin by thanking our speakers for their very interesting discussions and presentations, and then maybe turn it over to Raphael for any of his closing thoughts.
Well, thank you also very much. I hope you can hear me. I'm connecting through my phone. So apologies also for Zoom for the first time playing some tricks on us in a 2-year successful history. But thank you very much for the presentations. And thank you very much for moderating. And I hope to see you in the next edition. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you, everybody, again.